I flew back to Norfolk after a strategic analysis mission concerning Iran, not alerting my family because of a gut feeling of unease. The street where my grandmother lived was unusually dark, the familiar house without any lights turned on even though it was only 7 p.m. I opened the door using the old brass key she gave me when I enlisted, something she always said to use only in emergencies. The air inside the house was cold and silent to the point where I could clearly hear the weak sounds of a ventilator from the bedroom. I ran in and saw my grandmother Margaret lying alone, skin pale, her hand shaking slightly. Her phone displayed many missed calls to my mother, all of them unanswered. Outside the window was the silent darkness, but in my heart I had a feeling that something was very wrong happening. I wondered why not a single person in the family was here when she was in such a state. I have spent many years studying the enemy abroad, but never prepared for the enemy within my own family. Before I tell you what I found in my grandmother's house that night, the truth that would tear my family apart if stories about loyalty, betrayal, and standing up for the ones who stood by you resonate with you, consider liking and subscribing. Thank you for being here and listening to this story with me. The silence in the house was no longer just empty. It felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing against my chest. My military training kicked in the same tactical coldness I used when analyzing insurgent movements in the Middle East. I didn't panic. Instead, I bypassed the useless family group chats and called our longtime family physician directly on his private line. When he answered, his voice wasn't filled with the warmth I remembered from my childhood checkups. It was weary and somber. He confirmed my worst fears. Grandmother Margaret was in the final stages of congestive heart failure. Medical science had done what it could, but her heart, which had carried the burdens of a combat nurse in Vietnam for years, was finally giving out. "Elena," he whispered, "it could be a matter of days, perhaps only hours." I arranged for an emergency hospice nurse to arrive immediately. When the young woman in blue scrubs walked through the door and saw me standing there in my flight suit, still smelling of jet fuel and the stale air of a military transport plane, her eyes widened in genuine shock. She checked the monitors, adjusted the oxygen flow, and then looked at me with a pity that cut deeper than any blade. "Captain," she said softly, avoiding my gaze, "we are so relieved you're here. To be honest, we were under the impression that the patient had no surviving family left in the area. No one has checked in for over 48 hours." The words felt like a physical blow to the solar plexus. No surviving family. My parents lived less than 20 miles away in a gated community that screamed of the wealth my grandmother had helped them build. I stepped out into the hallway, my hands trembling as I dialed my father's number. Voicemail. I dialed my mother. Voicemail again. The rejection tones felt like a rhythmic mockery of the rhythmic beeping of the ventilator in the next room. In the intelligence world, when a target goes dark, you look for their digital footprint. I opened Instagram, my thumb hovering over my mother's profile. I expected to see a "do not disturb" post or perhaps a blurred photo of a pharmacy. Instead, the screen exploded with vibrant blues and shimmering golds. There they were. The story had been posted only 20 minutes ago, tagged in Cabo, San Lucas. The video showed my mother Laura wearing oversized designer sunglasses, laughing as she clinked a crystal flute of vintage champagne against my father's glass. They were on the deck of a luxury yacht, the Pacific sunset painting a golden halo around their betrayal. My father Daniel was leaning back, chest puffed out, looking every bit the successful real estate mogul, completely unburdened by the fact that his mother was gasping for her final breaths in a dark house in Virginia. Then I saw the caption written in a playful cursive font, "Finally escaping family stress. Living our best lives." I stared at the screen until the backlight dimmed. The stress they were escaping was the woman who had nursed them through every illness, the woman who had provided the seed money for my father's first investment, the woman currently dying alone while they celebrated their freedom from her burden. I walked back into the bedroom. The rhythmic hiss-click of the ventilator was the only pulse left in this house. I looked at Margaret, the woman who taught me that a Whittaker never retreats, and I felt a new sensation. It wasn't just the grief of a granddaughter or the duty of an officer. It was a cold, crystalline anger that settled into my marrow. As an intelligence officer, I am trained to identify patterns. I realized then that my parents weren't busy with a business crisis or unreachable due to a bad signal. This was a calculated desertion. They had looked at a dying woman and saw an inconvenience to be managed by distance. They were waiting for the phone call that told them the problem had resolved itself so they could return and collect the spoils of her $18.4 million estate. I sat by her bed, taking her frail, translucent hand in mine. The anger didn't make me loud. It made me quiet. It made me precise. My parents thought they were escaping stress, but they had actually left the door wide open for the one person they should have feared most. They forgot that while they were playing at high society games in Mexico, I had spent the last decade learning how to dismantle much more dangerous men than them. The abandonment was complete, but so was my resolve. They wanted a vacant house and a silent grave. What they were going to get instead was a daughter who knew exactly how to turn their escape into a prison of their own making. "I'm here now, Grandma," I whispered into the shadows, "and I'm not going anywhere. But they are going to wish they had never left." The house was a tomb of memories, but as I sat by Grandmother Margaret's bed, one specific memory clawed its way to the surface. It was the morning of my deployment to the Middle East 3 years ago. She had pulled me aside, her grip surprisingly firm for her age, and whispered, "Elena, if the world ever turns upside down, if something happens, and I'm not here to guide you, open the safe. Do not wait for your father. Do not ask for permission. Just open it." At the time, I thought it was just the nerves of a woman who had seen too much war herself. Now, looking at the empty hallway where my parents should have been standing, I realized it was a strategic briefing. I stood up, my boots thudding softly on the hardwood floor as I walked toward her private study. The room smelled of old paper and lavender. Behind a framed photograph of my grandfather in his flight suit was the wall safe, an old heavy iron model that looked out of place in this modern era. I didn't have to guess the combination. I knew the date engraved on our family's heart, the day Grandpa was shot down over the jungles of Vietnam. Click. Whir. Thump. The heavy door swung open. Inside, tucked away from the prying eyes of her own son, was a thick leather portfolio. My breath hitched as I pulled it out and spread the contents across the mahogany desk. There was a formal, Willa silver USB drive, a handwritten letter addressed to me, and a separate stack of legal documents bound in a blue folder. I opened the blue folder first, and my military mind, trained to process complex data under pressure, nearly short-circuited. 2 weeks ago, while my parents were likely planning their Cabo getaway, Margaret had executed a massive financial maneuver. She had moved $9.6 million of her liquid assets into a private living trust. But the real shock, the first true twist in this unfolding war, was buried in the fine print of the trust's management structure. I wasn't just a beneficiary. I had been named as the co-trustee 3 years ago. Margaret had granted me full legal authority over these assets the moment I stepped into this house, a power I never even knew I possessed. She had been protecting me from a distance even while I was halfway across the world. Then I turned to the will. My eyes scanned the legal jargon until they hit a bolded section, the presence clause. It was a condition precedent, a legal trap designed with the precision of a sniper. The clause stated that any heir named in the document would forfeit their entire portion of the inheritance if they were found to be voluntarily absent during the testator's final moments of life, provided they had been notified of the medical emergency. My parents hadn't just gone on vacation. They had walked directly into a minefield. By ignoring my calls and staying on that yacht in Cabo, they were effectively signing away their rights to the Whittaker fortune. They were trading an $18.4 million estate for a few days of champagne and sunshine. Finally, I picked up the handwritten letter. The paper was slightly yellowed and the ink was steady. "Elena, my brave girl," it began. "If you are reading this, it means you chose to stay. It means you followed the light home while others followed the lure of greed. I knew your father's heart had grown cold, and I knew your mother's soul had become shallow. I spent my life nursing soldiers back to health, but I couldn't fix the sickness in my own family. I have placed the keys to the kingdom in your hands because you are the only one who understands that presence is love. Use what I have left you to do what is right. They will come for the money, Elena. Let them find only the ghosts of what they threw away." I looked at the USB drive sitting on the desk. It felt heavy, like a loaded weapon. My grandmother hadn't just died, she had staged a final brilliant counterinsurgency. She knew my parents would abandon her, and she had built a legal fortress to ensure their betrayal would be their undoing. A cold smile touched my lips. My father Daniel thought he was the master of real estate and leverage. He had no idea that his mother had already foreclosed on his future. I tucked the documents back into the portfolio and headed back to the bedroom. The enemy was in Cabo, blissfully unaware that the family stress they were escaping was the only thing keeping them from total financial ruin. I took my place back at Margaret's side, the co-trustee of a multi-million-dollar trust and the guardian of a dying woman's final justice. The battle lines were drawn, and for the first time in my career, I didn't need a drone or a satellite to see the target. I just needed to wait for the sunrise. The weight of the leather portfolio was a familiar kind of burden. It felt like a mission file, one that required immediate, decisive action. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years, Nathan Cole. He was more than just a lawyer. He was a relic of my grandmother's past, a man who had navigated the complexities of the Whitaker estate for over 4 decades. He picked up on the third ring. "Nathan." I said, my voice steady and professional. "It's Elena. I'm at the house. I've opened the safe." There was a long, audible exhale on the other end of the line. "Thank God you're home, Captain." Nathan replied, his voice thick with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Margaret knew this day would come. She spent the last 5 years terrified that Daniel's greed would swallow her legacy whole. She didn't just plan for her passing, she planned for his betrayal. He spent the next 20 minutes confirming the tactical reality of the situation. Margaret hadn't been paranoid. She had been observant. She had watched my father transform from a son into a predator, eyes always fixed on the bottom line of her balance sheet. Nathan confirmed that every document I held was fully executed and notarized. "We need to establish a timeline, Elena," Nathan said, his tone shifting into legal combat mode. "I need a time-stamped record of your presence. The presence clause is the linchpin of this entire operation. If we can prove you were there while your parents were absent, the trust triggers automatically." I looked at my watch, a rugged military-grade Garmin, and synchronized it with the medical logs the hospice nurse had started. I took a photo of the ventilators display the date, and my own face reflected in the glass. "I'm logged in, Nathan. The nurse is a witness. I've been here since 1900 hours." "That's it then," Nathan said. "Under the terms of the living trust, the presence of a single eligible heir, that's you during the terminal phase, is the green light signal. It's enough to activate the protective measures." As the co-trustee, my first act was one of total economic containment. Nathan worked through the night filing the necessary injunctions and activating the digital kill switches Margaret had built into her financial architecture. Because my father's real estate business was heavily leveraged against my grandmother's assets collateral, he had likely coerced her into signing over years ago. The trust had the power to audit every linked account. The system began to freeze. It was like watching a digital frost creep across a map. The $18.4 million estate was no longer a buffet for my parents to feast upon. It became a locked vault. The investment accounts my father used for his high-stakes real estate flips were suddenly flagged for legal review. His credit lines backed by Whitaker Land were suspended. The house remained silent, but, in the digital world, a storm was raging. Around 3 a.m., the silence of the bedroom was shattered. My phone lying on the nightstand next to Margaret's medication began to vibrate violently against the wood. The caller ID flashed Daniel Whitaker. I let it ring, and then again, and again. On the fourth attempt, I answered. I didn't say hello. I simply waited. Elena. My father's voice was a jagged mess of panic and fury. Gone was the smooth, relaxed tone of the man on the yacht. I could hear the wind whipping in the background. He was likely still on the deck, but the party had clearly ended. What the hell is going on? I just got an alert from the bank. My primary investment account is locked. My corporate card was declined at the marina. They're saying there's a trustee block on everything. I looked at my grandmother. Her breathing was a shallow, rhythmic rasp. Grandma is dying, Dad. I said, my voice as cold as a Virginia winter. But you'd know that if you weren't 3,000 miles away drinking champagne. Don't you dare judge me, he hissed. I have businesses to run. Now call Nathan Cole and tell him there's been a mistake. You're a co-trustee. Since when you don't know the first thing about these finances, you're just a soldier. Undo this right now, or so help me. I didn't do this, Dad. I interrupted, feeling a strange sense of calm. Grandma did. She knew you wouldn't be here. She knew you'd choose the yacht over her bedside. And according to the documents in front of me, you didn't just leave her. You left your inheritance behind, too. What are you talking about, Elena? Listen to me. I ended the call. The silence rushed back into the room, but the vibrations didn't stop. My mother began texting a barrage of, how could you, and think of the family reputation. I ignored them all. I sat back down and took Margaret's hand. The financial war had begun, but for now, my only mission was to be the one person who didn't leave. The accounts were frozen, the traps were set, and for the first time in his life, my father was realizing that his best life was costing him everything he actually valued. The gray light of a Norfolk dawn began to bleed through the heavy velvet curtains, casting long, somber shadows across the medical equipment that had turned my grandmother's sanctuary into a sterile battlefield. It was a cold, pale morning, the kind that reminded me of early morning briefings before a mission, quiet, tense, and heavy with the weight of what was to come. Margaret was fading. The monitor's rhythmic chirp had slowed the peaks and valleys of her heart rate, flattening into a weary, shallow line. I checked my phone one last time. I had sent 3 urgent messages to my parents providing the medical status and the doctor's warning that the end was imminent. My mother had read the messages, the blue icons mocking me from the screen, but there was no reply. No flight confirmation. No frantic questions. Just a chilling digital silence from Cabo San Lucas. They weren't coming. They had weighed the cost of a last-minute private jet against the inconvenience of witnessing death, and they had chosen the beach. Suddenly, I felt a slight pressure on my hand. I looked down to see Margaret's eyes open just a sliver. They were clouded by age and medication, but in that moment they found mine with a clarity that shook me to my core. She wasn't the patient anymore. She was the combat nurse, the matriarch, the woman who had survived the loss of her husband and the disappointment of her son. She pulled me closer, her breath, a faint whisper of peppermint and iron. Thank you for coming back, Elena, she breathed. Her voice was like dry leaves skittering across pavement, but it carried the weight of a final benediction. You always understood the duty. I couldn't speak. I simply squeezed her hand, trying to transfer my own strength into her frail frame. A few minutes later, my phone vibrated. It wasn't a family member. It was a secure message from Nathan Cole. The clock has run out, Captain. Based on the documented medical timeline and your parents' confirmed location, the window for the presence clause has officially closed. They are legally absent by choice. The estate transition is now irrevocable. I'm sorry, Elena. Focus on her now. The legal war was won, but the victory tasted like ash. The hospice doctor entered the room shortly after, his face a mask of practiced empathy. He checked the vitals and then looked at me, noticing my uniform, my posture, and the grim set of my jaw. He knew he didn't need to sugarcoat the truth for a soldier. "Captain Whitaker," he said softly, "her body is tired. The machine is doing the work now, but the heart is finished. We are moving into the comfort care phase. I need you to sign the final authorization for the end-of-life protocol." He handed me a tablet. My hand, which had remained steady during intelligence debriefs and high-stakes tactical planning, trembled as I took the stylus. This was the most difficult order I had ever had to sign. To sign this was to accept that I was the last Whitaker standing guard. I scribbled my name, the digital ink feeling like a permanent seal on my childhood. "Are you ready?" the doctor asked, his hand hovering over the controls of the ventilator. I felt my chest tighten, a physical constriction that made it hard to breathe. In my world, we fought for every second. We optimized, we strategized, we pushed back against the inevitable. But looking at Margaret's peaceful, weary face, I knew that the greatest act of love I could offer was to let go. I wanted to scream at the sun to stop rising, to freeze time so I could have just one more hour of her being alive in this world, even if she was silent. But I was an officer, and I was her granddaughter. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and nodded. "I'm ready." The doctor began the process. Silence slowly reclaiming the room as the mechanical hiss-click faded away. I climbed onto the edge of the bed and held her, tucking her head against my shoulder, just as she had done for me when I was a child, afraid of the dark. She passed away in the absolute stillness of the Norfolk morning. There was no grand drama, no cinematic final words. Just a quiet transition from one state to another. Outside, the world continued to wake up, neighbors fetching their newspapers, cars starting up for the morning commute, completely unaware that a titan had left the earth. I sat there for a long time, holding a woman who had been abandoned by her own son, but escorted to the gates of the afterworld by the one person who honored her enough to stay. My parents were likely still asleep in their luxury villa, dreaming of the wealth they thought was coming to them. They didn't know yet that the dawn had brought their ruin. Grandmother Margaret was gone, and now the revenge part of my mission was the only thing left on the ledger. The phone felt cold against my ear as I dialed my father's number for the final time from that house. It was barely an hour after the coroner had left. When he finally picked up, I didn't wait for his greeting. "She's gone, Dad," I said, my voice sounding hollow in the empty hallway. There was a pause. For a second, just a single fleeting second, I hoped for a crack in his voice, a sob, or even a heavy sigh of regret. Instead, the first words out of his mouth were like a splash of acid. "Did she sign anything?" he asked, his tone sharp and clinical. "Before she went under. Did she sign any new documents or talk to Nathan Cole?" "Elena, this is critical. We need to know if she altered the estate distribution while she was confused." I closed my eyes, a bitter taste rising in my throat. "No." "How are you?" "No." "Was she in pain?" "Just a frantic concern for the paperwork." "We'll talk when you get here," I replied and hung up before he could respond. 2 days later, the front door of the Norfolk house swung open with a violence that shook the frames on the wall. My parents marched in, not like mourners but like conquerors, returning to claim a fallen city. They were dressed in expensive black linen designer morning wear that looked more like a fashion statement than a sign of grief. My father, Daniel, immediately began pacing the living room, eyeing the antique furniture and the artwork, as if he were already mentally tagging them for an auction. "Well," he said, throwing his keys onto the coffee table, It's a tragedy, of course, but at least now we can move forward. I've already spoken to a developer about the north property. This house is a bit of a relic. We'll likely list it by the end of the month. My mother Laura nodded as she checked her reflection in the hallway mirror. And the jewelry, Elena. I hope you haven't touched the safe. Most of those pieces are family heirlooms that naturally revert to me. I stood by the fireplace still in my uniform watching them with the detached curiosity of a predator. You seem very certain about what belongs to you, I said quietly. Of course we are, my father snapped. I am her only son. Under Virginia law, without a specific contrary instrument, I am the primary heir. It's a matter of blood and business. I walked over to the dining table and placed the leather portfolio down. I pulled out the new will and the living trust documents, sliding them across the polished wood. You should read the presence clause, Dad, and the section on the co-trustee powers. You lost your rights the moment you decided that a yacht in Cabo was more important than your mother's final breaths. The room went white hot. My father's face turned a deep mottled purple as he skimmed the pages. This is a sham, he roared, slamming his fist on the table. You manipulated her. You swooped in while she was senile and forced her to sign this. You've been plotting this from your base in Virginia, haven't you? Using your military intelligence to rob your own parents. My mother joined in, her voice shrill. You're a thief, Elena. A greedy, calculating thief. We'll have this overturned in a week. No judge will uphold a presence clause when we were clearly on a pre-planned vacation. I was prepared for their anger, but as the shouting continued, I noticed something on the side table, a small handwritten logbook left behind by Maria, the part-time caregiver, who had been with Grandma for the last 6 months. I picked it up, flipping through the pages, and saw a series of tucked-away receipts and a folded bank slip. The slip showed a series of wire transfers, $10,000 each, coming from a shell company I recognized as one of my father's real estate subsidiaries. The dates matched the weeks when Grandma's health had first begun its steep decline. I looked at the notes Maria had left. She had intentionally documented patient stable, no need to alert next of kin, on days when the medical records I'd obtained showed Grandma was struggling to breathe. Maria wasn't just negligent, she was being paid to keep the crisis quiet. She was paid to ensure I didn't fly home early. She was paid to make sure Grandma died before I could arrive, which would have left the estate wide open for my father. The realization hit me like a physical blow. They hadn't just accidentally missed her death. They had actively engineered her isolation. You paid her, I whispered, the anger in my voice replaced by a terrifying, icy calm. They both stopped shouting. You paid Maria to lie to me. You didn't just abandon Grandma. You were waiting for her to die. You wanted her to slip away in total silence so I wouldn't show up and trigger these clauses. You were betting on her being alone. My father didn't deny it. He didn't even flinch. He just straightened his tie and looked at me with cold, dead eyes. It's my inheritance, Elena. I wasn't going to let a disgruntled daughter and an old woman's whims get in the way of $18 million. Inner thought. I used to think the people I hunted overseas were the definition of cold-blooded, but they were fighting for a cause. My parents. They were just waiting for a pulse to stop so they could cash a check. The battle is just beginning, Elena, my father warned as he walked toward the door. Enjoy the house while you can. By the time my lawyers are done, you'll be lucky if you're left with your uniform. I watched them leave, my heart steeled. They thought this was about money. They still didn't realize I was an intelligence officer. And I had only shown them the first page of the file. After my parents stormed out, the house felt tainted, as if their greed had left a physical residue on the walls. I met Nathan Cole in the study that evening. The air was thick with the scent of old mahogany and the tension of the coming legal storm. Nathan sat behind the desk, his laptop open, the silver USB drive I'd found in the safe, glowing with a faint blue light. We've reviewed the first set of files, the trust, the bank accounts, the deeds. Nathan said, his face illuminated by the screen. But there's a subdirectory here, Elena. It's encrypted with a second password. The hint was, the sound of silence. I knew immediately. It was the title of the song Grandma used to hum when she sat on the porch. I typed it in, and the folder clicked open. Inside was a single video file titled, For the Court. Nathan pressed play. Grandmother Margaret appeared on the screen looking sharper and more formidable than she had in her final days. She was sitting in this very chair, her back straight. "If you are watching this," she began, her voice steady and echoing through the room, "it means my son Daniel has done exactly what I feared. It means he is contesting my will and attacking my granddaughter. If he has chosen the path of litigation over the path of respect, then you must play this recording." She leaned forward and the video cut to a digital audio interface. "This was recorded 3 months ago," her voiceover explained. "Daniel forgot that the security system I installed in this house includes a high-sensitivity intercom. He had a glass of scotch and a very loud conversation with his business partner Arthur in the garden." The audio hissed, then my father's voice filled the room. It was unmistakable, arrogant, predatory, and devoid of any warmth. "The old lady is hanging on by a thread," my father's voice rang out. "But here's the play, Arthur. I've already got the caregiver on the payroll. She's filtering the information. As long as Elena stays busy with her little war games at the base, she won't know the end is near. If my mother dies before Elena gets back here, the old 1998 will stand. I become the sole executor. The whole $18.4 million estate flows directly into our development project. We just need her to pass away in a quiet, empty house." The audio cut back to Grandma. She looked saddened but resolute. "He didn't just wait for me to die," she said softly. "He weaponized my loneliness. He tried to lock my own granddaughter out of my life for a paycheck. This wasn't negligence, Daniel. This was an ambush. And in the military, we know how to deal with ambushes." Nathan closed the laptop. The silence that followed was deafening. "This is it," he whispered. "This proves intent. It proves he actively conspired to prevent an heir from fulfilling the conditions of the will. It turns his absence from a mistake into a crime." But my parents weren't waiting for a courtroom to start their attack. By the next morning, the battle had moved to the public eye. My mother, using her connections in the Virginia social scene, had leaked a story to the local tabloids and several lifestyle blogs. The headlines were vicious: "War hero or wealth hunter uniformed daughter accused of manipulating dying grandmother." The articles portrayed me as a cold, calculating military officer who used psychological tactics to brainwash a confused elderly woman into signing over her fortune. They published photos of me in my Air Force dress blues next to shots of my mother looking distraught outside the Norfolk house. They called me the greedy granddaughter and suggested I was using my intelligence training to interrogate my own family for their inheritance. It was a classic PR smear campaign, the scorched earth policy. They wanted to ruin my reputation so thoroughly that I would settle just to make the headlines stop. A few days later, the formal blow landed. Nathan called me to say that a massive lawsuit valued at the full $18.4 million had been filed at the Norfolk County Courthouse. My father wasn't just contesting the will, he was suing for undue influence, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. He wanted it all. He wanted the money, the house, and my career. I stood in the kitchen of the house he wanted to tear down, looking at the headline on my phone. My parents thought they could win by being the loudest voices in the room. They thought that by dragging my name through the mud, I would retreat. They forgot one thing. In my line of work, we don't fear the mud. We use it for camouflage. "Nathan," I said into the phone, my voice as cold as the steel of the safe. "Don't release the video yet. Let them talk. Let them tell their lies to every reporter in Virginia. Let them get comfortable in their arrogance. Why? Nathan asked. Because, I replied, the bigger the stage they build for themselves, the further they have to fall when we pull the rug out. We aren't just going to win this case, we're going to make sure they never show their faces in this city again. The air inside the Norfolk County Courthouse felt thick with the weight of centuries-old justice. This was no longer a private family dispute. It had become a public spectacle. As I walked through the corridors of the courthouse, I could hear the muffled clicks of cameras and the whispers of reporters. My parents had made sure the gallery was packed, hoping to witness my public humiliation. They were already there when I entered the courtroom, flanked by a phalanx of high-priced attorneys from one of the most aggressive firms in D.C. My father Daniel sat with his chin tilted up, radiating the confidence of a man who believed money could buy any outcome. My mother Laura was dressed in a suit that cost more than my annual housing allowance, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief for the benefit of the cameras. I didn't wear designer labels. I wore my Air Force service dress uniform, the blue fabric crisp, the silver captain's bars on my shoulders, catching the fluorescent light, and my ribbons for overseas service pinned precisely above my heart. I didn't sit at the front. I stood quietly behind Nathan Cole, my posture rigid, my expression unreadable. I wasn't there as a grieving granddaughter. I was an officer under fire, and I was holding my ground. The lead attorney for my parents, a man with a booming voice and a predatory smile, opened the session with a scathing attack. Your Honor, he began, pacing the floor. This is a classic case of elder abuse disguised as military duty. Captain Whitaker used her specialized intelligence training, the very skills the taxpayers funded, to psychologically manipulate a dying, confused woman. She isolated Margaret Whitaker from her own son, the natural heir, and coerced her into signing documents that fly in the face of decades of family tradition. This wasn't a will. It was a hostile takeover. He painted a picture of me as a cold opportunist who had ambushed a weak-old woman in her final hours. My mother let out a theatrical sob. My father nodded solemnly. The judge, a stern woman with decades of experience, turned her gaze toward Nathan. Does the defense have a response? Nathan stood up slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The plaintiffs speak of isolation and confusion, Nathan said. But Margaret Whitaker was a woman of extraordinary foresight. She knew that in her final hour the only thing that would matter was who stood by her side. We would like to present a piece of evidence that was recovered from a secure server belonging to the deceased. The lights dimmed. A large screen descended from the ceiling. When the video of Grandma Margaret appeared, the courtroom fell into a vacuum of silence. She looked directly into the camera, her eyes piercing. The recording played her voice, not the weak rasp of her final day, but the voice of a commander. Then the audio of my father's secret garden conversation played. The sound of my father plotting to wait for her to die in an empty house while paying off the caregiver echoed through the chamber. The socialites in the gallery gasped. My mother's handkerchief dropped to her lap. My father's face went from smug confidence to a sickly pale gray. In the video, Grandma Margaret sighed a sound of profound disappointment. Daniel thinks he is playing a game of chess, she said on the screen. But he forgot that I raised him. He stayed away to protect his greed. Elena stayed to protect me. Only Elena stayed. And in this family we reward those who hold the line. The video cut to black. The silence that followed was absolute. But Nathan wasn't finished. He pulled a final document from his briefcase. Your Honor, there is one final provision in the Whitaker Living Trust that the plaintiffs seem to have overlooked in their haste to sue. It is a no-contest clause, also known as an in terrorem clause. Nathan turned to face my father, his eyes cold. Margaret Whitaker left a final safety net of $3.2 million in a secondary fund intended to be distributed to Daniel and Laura Whitaker, despite their behavior, provided they accepted the terms of the primary will without litigation. However, Nathan raised the document. The clause states explicitly that any beneficiary who challenges the validity of the trust or the will in a court of law shall be immediately and irrevocably disinherited from all remaining assets. The lead attorney for my parents looked like he had been struck. He frantically began whispering to my father. Because Daniel and Laura Whitaker chose to file this $18.4 million lawsuit. Nathan continued, his voice echoing like a gavel. They have triggered the no contest clause. They didn't just lose the house. They didn't just lose the $15.2 million in the main trust. By standing in this courtroom today, they have officially forfeited the final $3.2 million. They are leaving this courthouse with nothing. My father let out a choked sound, half growl and half sob. My mother looked as if she were about to faint. They had gambled everything on a lie, and the truth hadn't just defeated them, it had bankrupted them. I didn't feel a surge of joy. I just felt a deep, quiet sense of justice. The enemies within had been identified, engaged, and neutralized. The defense rests, Nathan said. I looked at my parents one last time. They weren't the titans of Norfolk real estate anymore. They were just two people who had traded their mother's love for a pile of gold, only to find the gold had turned to dust the moment they tried to steal it. The courtroom cleared out with a haunting clinical speed. My parents didn't scream, and they didn't make a scene. The weight of the no contest clause had seemingly crushed the air out of their lungs. My father walked past me, his eyes fixed on the floor, looking suddenly aged and brittle. My mother followed, her designer heels clicking hollowly on the marble, avoiding my gaze as if I were a ghost. They left in a silence that was far more deafening than any of their earlier shouting. They were survivors of a self-inflicted wreck, heading toward a future where the Whitaker name was a burden rather than a badge of status. I returned to the house in Norfolk alone. The absence of the medical equipment and the lawyers left the rooms feeling vast and echoey. For the first time since my return from the Middle East, I wasn't an intelligence officer or a co-trustee. I was just a granddaughter in an empty house. I began the long, cathartic process of cleaning, moving through the layers of Margaret's life. In the back of a cedar-lined closet tucked beneath a stack of handmade quilts, I found a small weathered wooden box. Inside, resting on a bed of yellowed letters, was a triangle of tightly folded fabric, the burial flag from my grandfather's funeral in 1969. Margaret had kept it hidden, a sacred relic of the man she had waited for, and the war that had defined them both. The following weekend, I drove north to Arlington National Cemetery. The rolling hills of white headstones stood like a silent army under the Virginia sun. I found the site where my grandfather's memory was honored and sat there for a long time, the folded flag resting on my lap. I felt the immense weight of the Whitaker legacy, not the millions of dollars or the real estate, but the grit and the sacrifice. As I stood up to leave, an older man in a faded VFW cap, his chest decorated with service medals, paused nearby. He looked at my uniform, then at the flag in my hands, and finally at my face. He didn't know about the trial, the Cabo scandal, or the $18.4 million. He just saw a soldier honoring her own. "Beautiful day for it, Captain," he said, his voice gravelly but kind. He offered a slow, respectful salute to the headstone. "I knew nurses like your grandmother back in the day, tougher than the pilots. She stayed the course, and so did you. She'd be damn proud of you for holding the line." He nodded once and continued his walk. At that moment, the icy knot that had been tightened in my chest since I first stepped off the plane in Norfolk finally began to unravel. The revenge was over, the justice was served, but the redemption, that was something quieter. It was the realization that while my parents had inherited nothing, I had inherited the only thing that actually mattered: the strength to stay when everyone else walked away. For the first time in weeks, I breathed in the fresh air of the cemetery and felt the pain in my heart lighten, replaced by a steady, quiet peace. The battle in the courtroom was over, but the work of honoring Margaret's life was just beginning. I had no desire to live a life of hollow luxury built on the wreckage of my family's greed. To move forward, I had to dismantle the monuments of my parents' vanity. I started by selling the two sprawling vacation homes, one in Aspen and another on the Florida coast properties Grandma had purchased years ago that my parents had treated like their private playgrounds. The sales brought in $4.2 million, every cent of which was funneled into a newly established endowment, the Margaret Whitaker Foundation. The foundation's mission was simple but vital: to provide support for lonely veterans and elderly individuals who had been abandoned by their families. We created programs to ensure that no one who served their country or who spent their lives building a home would ever have to face their final days in the dark, wondering where their loved ones were. As for the family home in Norfolk, I couldn't bear to see it turned into another cold real estate investment. Instead, I oversaw its transformation into a community hospice center, a sanctuary where the air was filled with light music and the constant presence of caregivers who actually cared. On the day of the grand opening, I stood on the same porch where I had once stood as a child. I wasn't wearing my flight suit. I was wearing the peace of a woman who had finally completed her mission. Looking out at the gathered crowd of veterans, neighbors, and volunteers, I pulled out Grandma's final letter and read the 3 words that had redefined my life. Presence is love. As I spoke those words, I looked at the garden where my father had once plotted his betrayal. The flowers were in bloom, and the silence was no longer heavy, it was full. I finally realized that the $18.4 million wasn't the kingdom Grandma had left me. The money was just a tool. The true legacy was the lesson she taught me through her life and her death: that the most valuable thing we can give another human being is our time and our unwavering presence when the world gets quiet and the shadows get long. I stayed for her, and in doing so, I saved myself. If you are listening to this story and have ever had to choose between family expectations and your own peace of mind, know that you are not alone. Please let me know which city you are listening from, or share your own story of courage and justice in the comments below. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs to hear this message today. And if you want to hear more stories about justice, healing, and the strength to do what is right, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next video.